Okay, now we're going to talk a bit about digestion. Digestion is actually a pretty complicated process with multiple phases that include ingestion of the food, movement of food down the digestive system, the mechanical and chemical digestion. So there's two different processes that aid in the digestion of nutrients, absorption of those nutrients, and also elimination. There are quite a few main components of the digestive system. It's not just the stomach. So if food makes us what we are, but it's the digestive system that converts it into usable molecules. There is the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract, which is basically a tube within a tube, and we'll talk about that. It provides a direct link or a direct path between organs and consists of the mouth, the pharynx, so here we have the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and also the rectum. So those are the key components of the digestive system, and we are going to talk about most of those today. So as food is chewed in the mouth, it's mixed with saliva. Saliva is a watery secretion that's released by the salivary glands, and the release of saliva is triggered by a bunch of things, including smell, taste, and sometimes even the thought of food. So if you can think of something that's super tasty to eat, that could trigger the release of saliva. Because the release of saliva is reduced during sleep, this is one reason why bacteria will accumulate on our teeth, because saliva actually helps to kill or at least neutralize some bacteria. Bacteria break down macroscopic food particles that remain in our mouths at night, which is what leads to morning breath. I mentioned in the previous slide there are a couple of different types of digestion. One is mechanical. That's the more physical process, so chewing, tearing, grinding, mashing, and mixing. All of those things are mechanical digestion. But there's also chemical. So this would be enzymatic reactions that help improve the digestion of a couple of specific things: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. The mouth is kind of step number one in the digestive system. It does a few different things. One of those is a sensory analysis of the material before swallowing. So what is it? That would be the taste of the food. There is, in the mouth, there's also the mechanical processing through the actions of the teeth, the tongue, and also the surfaces of the mouth. In the mouth, there's also limited digestion of both carbohydrates and lipids. And this is mostly from the salivary glands. So those salivary glands secrete into the oral cavity. That's the mouth. And they have different properties. So salivary glands, interestingly, they produce about 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva a day. That's a lot of saliva. They are mostly water. In fact, they are 99.4% water. And the rest of the components of saliva would be a little bit of enzymes that help break things down, a little bit of proteins, some electrolytes. So saliva is a pretty interesting thing. The teeth are really important in the digestive system. They mechanically break down food into small pieces. The tongue also plays a role by mixing food with saliva, which contains a particular enzyme called amylase, which helps to break down starch. The tooth consists of an enamel, which is a hard outer layer, a softer layer in the inside, and then also the pulp. So here we have a cross-section of a tooth, and you see the enamel layer on the outside, the dentin, which is the softer layer, and then the pulp, which is inside, which is where the nerves and blood vessels are. Plaque adheres to the surface of the teeth. It actually adheres to the enamel, and what happens is it can trap bacteria into itself. It's kind of like a sticky substance. And that is what causes cavities. So bacteria that live on your teeth, they actually secrete plaque. and the plaque will trap the bacteria against the teeth and then cause cavities. What's one reason why, other than removing some of the bacteria from your teeth, it's one reason why brushing your teeth is important, because the fluoride in toothpaste actually helps to harden the enamel. So the tongue, I mentioned previously, it helps to mix the food. It also helps swallowing. So the tongue pushes food to the back of the oral cavity and into the pharynx, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second. And the tongue also contains taste receptors on its upper surface. So here's a picture of the tongue. It helps to push food back into the back of the oral cavity, and on the surface of the tongue are a bunch of different taste receptors. This is an excellent time to mention, if you've ever heard that the tongue has different spots on it that have specific receptors, so example, sweet receptors in the front, salty receptors on the side, that's actually not true. Your tongue has a variety of different types of taste receptors, and they're spread all over the tongue. The epiglottis is the next key part in digestion. So the epiglottis is a flap-like structure that's in the back of the throat, and what it does is it covers the trachea. Trachea, another name for the trachea is the windpipe. It covers the trachea to prevent food from entering it. So when you swallow your food, the epiglottis actually covers the trachea, which then forces the food down into the esophagus. So if we're looking at this cross section here, we've got the tongue, and the epiglottis is this little flap-like structure here, and it covers the trachea or windpipe, allowing the food to travel down the esophagus. Here is another picture of this process. So the bolus, or the green thing, would be the food. It will enter the pharynx and the soft palate, and when it does that, so this is the mouth here, and when the tongue pushes the food back into the back of the oral cavity, one of the things that happens is the soft palate here closes the nasal cavity. So you've got this, the nasal cavity connects to the same tube, and you don't want to swallow your food and have it come out of your nose. So the soft palate actually closes the nasal cavity, which then forces the food bolus to travel down. Once the food bolus does travel down, it meets the epiglottis, and it presses on the epiglottis, which causes it to then close and cover the trachea so that you won't get food going down your windpipe. I'm sure all of us have had the sensation of getting liquid in the windpipe, and that is unpleasant. Can you imagine getting food down your windpipe? Even more unpleasant. Then the bolus will then enter the esophagus. So after it's past the trachea and past the epiglottis, then the bolus will travel down the esophagus. The esophagus transports food to the stomach via a process called peristalsis. So one of the things that's important about the digestive system is that the swallowing action is a voluntary action, which is what's caused when the tongue pushes food into the back of the oral cavity. From that point on, the movement of food down the digestive system is involuntary. So here is the esophagus. The esophagus is basically a giant tube that goes all the way down to the stomach. We've talked about this part of it here. Here we have the trachea and the epiglottis, and then behind it is the esophagus. The esophagus is approximately 10 inches long. It does a lot of important things. It secretes a mucus, which helps food travel down. It also moves food from the throat to the stomach in a movement called peristalsis, which I'll talk about on the next slide. One of the things that happens is when food reaches the stomach, you have something called a gastroesophageal sphincter, which basically closes the entry point of the food from the esophagus to the stomach, that allows food to enter. And if that muscle does not close, that glossoesophageal sphincter doesn't close, then acid from the stomach can rise up into the esophagus, causing irritation, or what we would more know it as heartburn. So peristalsis is a really important and interesting movement. It's basically the easiest way to think of it is a wave-like movement of the muscles, which helps move food down the digestive system. So along your esophagus, you have these longitudinal muscles and also these circular muscles. And the circular muscles contract, which means tighten, behind the bolus. And then the longitudinal muscles ahead of the bolus contract. So step one, contraction of the circular muscles behind the bolus. So these muscles are contracting. And then the next step, that the longitudinal muscles also contract. And that process causes the muscles to move in a wave-like format, which pushes the food along as it goes. So that is peristalsis. The stomach stores the food and also releases it into the small intestine in small chunks. The liquids from the salivary glands and also glands in the stomach turn food into a thin, watery paste that's known as chyme. I'll talk more about that in a second. The stomach itself can hold 2 to 4 liters of liquefied food. The stomach is a J-shaped, basically like a muscular bag that stores food that you eat. It breaks it down. It also mixes the food with the digestive juices in the stomach that contain the enzymes that help break down both proteins and lipids. It also has an acid that helps to kill bacteria in the stomach. And typically, it takes the stomach about 4 hours to do its job, depending on what types of foods are being digested. So there are certain foods that are digested very quickly and others that take a little bit longer time. So here is the stomach. You've got the esophagus. This would be the point of the gastroesophageal sphincter, so the part of the muscles that would clinch together, preventing anything from inside the stomach to travel back up the esophagus. And then the stomach itself connects to the small intestine here. Contrary to what you may believe, there's actually very little digestion that occurs in the stomach. The stomach is really more of a prep space. It prepares the food for digestion. The only thing that gets even just partially digested in the stomach is actually proteins. The stomach itself has 3 layers of smooth muscle that mix the food all around and also that help to push it into the small intestine where most of the digestion actually occurs. It also has 2 sphincters that allow the inflow, that's the gastroesophageal sphincter, and also the outflow movement of food. So you've got the gastroesophageal sphincter on one side that controls the movement of food into the stomach, and the pyloric sphincter on the other side, which controls the movement of food out of the sphincter. Again, here's a description, a picture just showing the 3 different layers of smooth muscle, all that help to mix and move food around. So I mentioned that chyme, the stomach turns everything into liquefied food. So again, here we're looking at the stomach with the esophagus and chyme. So this is a picture of the liquefied food in the stomach, which is the chyme. Solid food like meat is actually emptied slower than liquid food like milkshakes because it takes longer to get the solid food like meat into this chyme format. As the stomach empties, the contractions in the walls of the stomach are actually felt as hunger pains. So that's a real thing. It's the contraction of the stomach while it's empty. As the chyme and protein leave the stomach, the gastric gland secretion actually decreases. So the glands within the stomach, the secretion of those enzymes gets lower after the stomach is empty. So the next stop on the digestive tract is the small intestine. The small intestine is a small coiled tube that would be about 20 feet long in adults. This is where 90% of the digestion occurs. So not your stomach. Most things are digested in the small intestine. One of the really important things about the small intestine that we'll talk about in the next couple slides is the idea that the structure of the small intestine really is important when you think about the function of the small intestine. So the small intestine is where digestion occurs. It's also a very important site of absorption of nutrients. So you eat the food, and you eat the food because it has important nutrients that your body needs, and most of those nutrients are taken into the body in the small intestine. And one of the ways that the structure of the small intestine helps to dictate that function is through these finger-like projections along the walls of the intestine called villi. And what these villi do, here's the picture of the small intestine. If you blow it up, you can see these finger-like projections, is increase the surface area. So they're giving more places where your body is able to absorb nutrients. The villi itself, so these finger-like projections, are covered with something called microvilli. So there's villi upon villi, which help to further increase the surface area for absorption of nutrients. So here is another picture of that. The intestinal epithelium is the lining of the intestine, and it is specifically suited for absorption of nutrients. It's very folded with finger-like projections that are both villi and microvilli, which increases the surface area for nutrient uptake. Virtually all the food and nutrient absorption occurs here, and most of the nutrients pass in, so from the intestine into the body through a process of diffusion. So here is another picture I wanted to show you of the villi upon villi. So here is the small intestine. If you take a cross section of the small intestine, this is what it looks like. And if we were to zoom in on one portion of that, you could see the villi. That's here, these finger-like projections. And then if we were to zoom in a little more and then zoom in one more time, you can see that each one of these villi, these finger-like projections, are made up of a bunch of even smaller finger-like projections, or the microvilli. Enzymes break down large food molecules into smaller ones that can pass through the lining of the intestine, where then they enter the bloodstream. Digestion in the small intestine requires enzymes from two specific sources. One of them is the lining of the intestine itself, and the other one is the pancreas. The pancreas produces enzymes that are really important for digestion. Here is a picture of the pancreas here. It kind of sits right below the stomach, right at the sort of beginning of the small intestine. That's the pancreas, a place that produces enzymes that are important for digestion. The liver is another thing that plays a role in digestion. Bile flow, okay, well, let's take a step back. The liver does a bunch of different things that's important for digestion. It helps to store some important nutrients like vitamins and glucose. It also produces bile, and bile plays an important role in the digestion of fat. Bile flow into the intestines could be blocked by something called gallstones, which are deposits of cholesterols and other materials in the gallbladder. So here we look at the liver. The gallbladder sits just underneath the liver. The gallbladder is what stores bile, and bile will travel from the gallbladder into the intestines to help for digestion of fat. But there are times when that process could be interrupted by gallstones, which is a buildup of cholesterol. The lack of bile in the intestine reduces the ability to digest lipids and also to absorb lipids. Bile does another thing besides just helping to digest fat. It also plays a role in filtering out, the liver itself also plays a role by filtering out the toxins and waste, specifically the toxins and waste that are associated with drugs and alcohol. The large intestine is the next stop on the digestive tract. The large intestine's main role is for reabsorption of water. There are four main regions of the large intestine. Um, the cecum, the appendix, the colon, and the rectum, and I'll mention those in just a second. So the large intestine itself serves to reabsorb water. It also compacts the contents of the intestine into feces. It plays a role in some absorption of vitamins, mostly the types of vitamins that are produced by bacteria. And it also plays a role in storing fecal matter prior to defecation. After most of the food and nutrients have been absorbed, the remaining food passes into the large intestine, which is about 5 feet long. Here's a picture of the large intestine. And as I said before, it has 4 main parts. The first part is the cecum. That's here. The cecum is like an expanded pouch. It receives material from the small intestine and stores it. It also begins compactation. You've got then the next step up is you've got the ascending colon and the transverse colon and the descending colon. This is all just parts of the colon itself that serve to compact and compact fecal matter, but also absorb water. And then you get to the rectum, which is here. That would be the exit of fecal matter. Another location that is part of the intestine is the appendix. And I thought I had something on the appendix here. Well, the appendix itself is a pretty interesting part of the digestive system. It used to be thought to have no function. People largely believe that it used to play a role in digestion, but it's as our diets changed that it stopped having a role. But recently, there's evidence that suggests that it might play a crucial role in replacing the good bacteria in your gut. So you need bacteria in your gut to help with digestion of food. There's good bacteria and there's bad bacteria. And one of the things that happens when you take antibiotics is it kills all the bacteria, even the good bacteria. And the evidence suggests that the appendix actually plays a role in replacing some of that bacteria after you've had antibiotics, so after that bacteria has been wiped out. Okay, now digestion, I mentioned, it starts out as a voluntary process, that's the chewing and swallowing, and then moves into an involuntary process. Those involuntary processes are largely controlled by both the nervous and endocrine system. The endocrine system could be thought of as hormones. Like any other physiological process, the proper functioning of the digestive system requires control and communication. So maintaining the control requires the participation of both the nervous and endocrine system, interacting with the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract. If there's some mistake or some misstep in that communication, then you could have dysfunction in those systems. Salivation is a nervous reflex, and the secretion of gastric glands that are important in digestion is controlled by both external stimuli, so smelling, seeing, but also there are receptors in your stomach that can indicate the presence of particular things like proteins that will then cause the secretion of gastric enzymes to help break down those proteins. This is the very last picture. This picture is in your book, and I like it because it kind of goes over the whole process. It's a good summary picture of the process of digestion. So you have food entering the mouth cavity, salivary glands are playing the role. Then food goes down the esophagus and gets into the stomach, where you have both storage and minimal digestion. You then enter into the small intestine, where you have the pancreas playing a role, both the liver and gallbladder playing a role. Then you have both digestion and absorption in the small intestine before it enters into the large intestine, where digestion ends and water absorption continues. and then you have undigested materials being released. So that this final picture is a really good picture of digestion, which is way more of a complicated process than I think you would think of at first.